The debit and credit concept, what you need to understand when we talk about accounting is that it's actually double entry bookkeeping, okay? So when you want to register a transaction in Odoo, you always need to have a balanced journal entry. You have one part on the debit side and one part on the debit side and one part on the credit side, and debit must always equal credit. You can't register a transaction without this rule being granted, depending on how your accounts that you're using are behaving on the debit and credit side. It will have an impact on your reports. So for example, if you want to register a salary entry on one side, on the debit side, you're going to have the expense of your employees cost, okay? And you're going to need a counterpart, and this counterpart, and this counterpart, and this counterpart is the employee's debt, and in that case, you're using a current liabilities account. Basically, it's what you owe to the employee and what you're going to have to pay them at the end of the month. So let's see together how the different accounts work. So for active account, let's start with that. Let's say, for example, that you buy a new car. The car itself needs to be accounted for in your balance sheet. In a fixed asset account for active accounts. If you want to increase the value of this type of accounts, then you will put the amount on the debit side in our example. As you buy a new car, it's an additional value that you want to include in your asset, and thus in your active part of your balance sheet. So the value of the car will be put on the debit side of the account in the accounting entry related to the purchase of the car. Let's now switch to passive accounts. Passive accounts work the other way around than active accounts. Let's take the following example. You receive a vendor bill for the purchase of furniture. For example, the debt of you. The debt you owe to your vendor is to be represented in your payable account. So it's your vendor bill. That's the thing that you're going to have to pay at the end due. When the vendor bill is due, payables accounts are part of your liabilities, which is also part of the passive accounts of the balance sheet. In that case, if you need to increase the amount of liability that you have in our codes, we have a new debt that we owe to our vendor. The value of the debt needs to be represented on the credit side of the payable account expense account. We're gonna stick to the same example with the vendor bill. We'll see that deeper in the next videos, but a vendor bill is always composed of two accounts: a payable account and an expense account. Available represent a debt to your vendor. But it's also where you record the costs that you need to represent in your profit and loss statement in our example. The purchase of furniture is an additional cost that we want to show in our PL. In order to do that, the value of the cost will be put on the debit side of the account if we combine this with the previous example with the passive accounts. We see that the id of the double entry is now complete because on the debit side, you're going to have the expense account, and then its counterpart is going to be on the credit side with the payable account. Lastly for income accounts. Let's take an example. If you sell to your customers and products, you will generate an invoice. The sale of goods represents an income to your company. So it's a positive thing. This income needs to be represented in your PL statements. When you want to increase the value of your income accounts, you need to put this amount on the credit side. So you can see here that the behavior is similar, so passive and active are contrary. So active will increase on the debit side and passive accounts will increase on the credit side, and that's the same thing for expenses and income. Debit and credit concept. Debit and credit is the foundation of what accounting is like. As an accountant, the day-to-day activities are double entry bookkeeping. That's the base of everything. A journal entry is composed of two parts. One side is the debit and the other side is the credit, and main concept of all accounting is that debit should always equal credit. If you don't have that, you don't have that, you don't have that, you don't have that, you don't have, basically it's not going to be possible to post these entries. Once you record the journal item, you'll always find a counterpart, and you won't be able to post items that are not unbalanced, so which means if your debit doesn't equal your credit, you can't save your journal entry, and you're going to be stuck depending on how your account is going to be debited or credited. It will have an impact on your reports. So let's take a few examples. First, we're going to see a salary entry. So, a cellular entry is composed again of two parts mainly, and we're not going to see this into details on one side. You're going to have the employee's costs, so what it cost you to a company, and the cost is represented in an expense account. Regarding the accounts types, it's going to help you understand this topic, and the cost should be represented on the debit side, and the counterpart of this entry is the employee's debt, so what you owe to your employee. So their salary basically, and debts that you owe to another on a third party, like a supplier, but also your employees should be recorded in a current liability account, and as it is a counterpart of a debit, should blow in the credit. Next example, you receive a payment from your customer. So you have an additional value in your bank account, so it goes in the bank and cash account, and should go on the debit side, and the counterpart of it is your customer's debt that we have settled, so the customer debt is represented in a current asset account. So when we receive the money, we want to make sure that this account is settled, so there is no more debt in it, because we received the money, so this is why it is a counterpart of a customer payment. As I said, accounts can have different behaviors on the debit and credit side, depending on their nature. So just take a look at this table. The first type of account is what we call an active account. We're going to see that more in details to see what this is about. So active accounts, for example, a bank account is an active account if you want to increase the value of this account, because in our last example, when we receive the customer payment, the value of our bank account increases. We want to record this value on the debit side, and once, for example, if we pay a supplier, we decrease the value of our bank account, so it should be recorded on the credit side. Passive accounts have the opposite behavior. So, for example, a supplier debt. So if you owe money to you have a vendor bill, so you have this vendor represented. That's that you have towards your supplier. When you receive this vendor bill, you need to increase the value of debts, the amount of debt that you had towards your supplier. So in that case, if you have an increase in this account, you have to credit the value. Okay, so the payable account is a passive account, and as such, if you increase the payable, because you have a new vendor bear, you need to credit the account, the expense accounts, if you want in that case. So remember the employee's cost. In that case, it's an expense account if you want to increase the value of it, because you have a new cost. In that case, it's going to be a debit value. If you want to increase the cost, and for income counts, going to be the contrary. So when you record a sales invoice, the income in the sales entry is going to be on the credit side.